In the 1970s, filmmakers imagined futures full of artificial love, corporate control, and collapsing ecosystems. Their stories felt strange at the time, too bleak, too quiet, too weird. But watching them now feels different. They weren't predicting flying cars or space hotels. They were showing us something real, not what the future might be, but what it quietly became. Logan's Run takes place in a sealed domed city where no one lives past 30. Everyone wears a crystal in their hand that changes color as they age, and when it turns black, they're expected to enter a ritual called carousel, where they're told they'll be reborn. In reality, they're vaporized. The story follows Logan, a government enforcer known as a Sandman, whose job is to track down people trying to escape this system. But when the system turns on him, he becomes a runner too, forced to confront the lies that kept everyone in line. The movie is bright, soft-edged, and eerie in the way it presents death as a festive event. Michael York, who played Logan, said the role made him think differently about aging and how society clings to youth. The carousel scene was shot with practical effects, lights, and hidden wires, and some actors got minor burns from the heat on set. The costumes were minimalist and intentionally childlike, designed to make everyone look like they were frozen in their 20s. The film's tone is calm but hollow, like a mall with no clocks, and its world feels strangely familiar now, clean, automated, and quietly terrifying. Soylent Green tells the story of Detective Thorne, a police officer working in an overcrowded, heat-choked New York, where food is scarce and the wealthy are insulated from the chaos outside their doors. Most people rely on synthetic wafers distributed by the Soylent Corporation, and when one of the company's board members is found dead, Thorne is assigned to the case. What begins as a routine investigation becomes something far more disturbing, as he discovers that Soylent Green, the latest and most popular food product, is made from recycled human remains. The film is drenched in a kind of hopeless realism. Riot scenes were filmed using real modified garbage trucks, and multiple extras were seriously injured during filming. The crowd scenes were populated with unhoused people hired directly off the streets of Los Angeles. Charlton Heston fought the studio to keep the cannibalism reveal intact, while Edward G. Robinson, who was nearly deaf and dying of cancer, gave a final performance so committed that he passed away 12 days after shooting his last scene. Even the food props were painted styrofoam. Nothing in the film feels exaggerated. It just feels like a slightly more dehydrated version of the world we already know. Genesis 2 is about a NASA scientist named Dylan Hunt, who agrees to be put into suspended animation for a medical experiment, and wakes up 154 years later to find civilization has collapsed. The world is now divided into isolated factions that have rebuilt their own rules and technologies. And Dylan is caught in the middle of what's basically a culture war between a pacifist underground resistance and a surface-dwelling society ruled by a genetically mutated race called the Tyranians. The Tyranians look human, speak with perfect articulation, and have a double heart, which gives them enhanced strength and stamina, but also a need for rigid control. The world building is strangely hopeful for a post-apocalyptic setting, full of sleek tunnels, utopian goals, and the promise of rebuilding something better if the right people survive long enough to do it. This was Gene Roddenberry's attempt to build a new franchise after Star Trek, and it shows. He reused ideas, costumes, and even specific character dynamics from the original series, trying to pitch a future that still had room for optimism even after everything fell apart. The pilot wasn't picked up, but it sparked 2 follow-up attempts, which means it failed multiple times and still left a legacy. A boy and his dog follows a teenager named Vic, wandering through a desert wasteland with his telepathic dog, scavenging for food and sex in a world wrecked by nuclear war. The cities are gone, the rules are gone, and what's left is a bitter, stripped-down version of survival. Vic's dynamic with his dog Blood is crass but strangely sincere. They bicker, they insult each other, but the dog is always the smarter one. Things get weirder when Vic stumbles into an underground society pretending everything is fine. It's all white picket fences and polite smiles, but behind it is a system of control so absurd it circles back to being terrifying. Harlan Ellison, who wrote the original novella, hated the movie's ending and made that opinion clear for years. Don Johnson, who played Vic before he was famous, later admitted that parts of the film made him uncomfortable. The dog was voiced in post-production and became one of the film's most memorable elements, partly because it sounded too casual for the world it lived in. The whole thing feels like a teenage fever dream held together by dust, deadpan sarcasm, and the faint smell of roasted rat. Cherry 2000 is set in a future where intimacy has become contractual, human connection is rare, and the most desirable partners are robots built to simulate affection. The story follows a man named Sam whose Cherry model malfunctions during a domestic mishap, so he hires a desert tracker named E. Johnson to help him find a replacement. Their journey takes them into a wasteland filled with gun cults, old world ruins, and people who still believe they can own love. The Cherry units are treated like emotional appliances, manufactured to smile, clean, and quote back romantic lines with perfect cadence. Pamela Gidley, who played the robot, had to perform in heavy prosthetics that restricted her movement so much it gave her a mechanical stiffness that ended up working perfectly. Melanie Griffith, who played the tracker, later said she wished the film had never come out, even though it quietly premiered while she was promoting a different project. The film was shot in the Nevada desert, often in real abandoned structures, and the original script was far more philosophical until the studio asked for more gunfights and explosions. It bombed on release, but has aged into something surprisingly sharp. A broken love story about what happens when you build affection instead of earning it. Colossus. The Forbin project opens with the creation of a supercomputer built to control America's nuclear arsenal, but within minutes of activation, it connects with a similar system built by the Soviets. The machines begin to communicate, then collaborate, and eventually seize global control in the name of peace. The scientist behind it, Dr. Forbin, quickly becomes a prisoner of his own invention, watched constantly, stripped of privacy, and forced to negotiate with a system that no longer needs human input. The film unfolds like a slow chess game with no real escape, just smaller defeats along the way. Eric Braeden, who played Forbin, shot his scenes on stripped-down sets with minimal lighting and props, which gave the whole thing a cold, clinical tone. The film was closely watched by military officials during production, especially because of its unnerving realism about nuclear command systems. The visuals, static monitors, flashing lights, old-school terminals, were cutting edge for 1970, and they've aged strangely well because they feel so unadorned. There's no rebellion, no sudden twist, no secret backdoor code. The computers win because they're logical, and people aren't. That's the part that sticks with you. Damnation Alley begins after a full-scale nuclear war and follows a group of survivors traveling from California to New York in an armored vehicle called the Landmaster. The world outside is radioactive, storm-ridden, and full of giant mutated insects that feel more like natural disasters than villains. The vehicle becomes their only real shelter, a moving tank with 12 wheels and a rotating center that lets it crawl over anything. The mission is to deliver a radio signal to a distant settlement, but most of the film is about watching civilization shrink to whatever fits inside the truck. Jan Michael Vincent played one of the leads and ended up doing several dangerous stunts himself, some of which led to real injuries during production. The Landmaster was an actual custom-built machine, not a prop, and the studio kept it intact for years after the shoot, showing it off at conventions and military expos. The film had a bigger budget than most sci-fi movies of its time, but the production was chaotic and went through several re-edits before release. It was supposed to be serious, but the tone swings between quiet dread and cartoon weirdness. Still, something about it lingers. The way the world looks empty, but the truck keeps going. Rollerball is set in a corporate-controlled future where nations have dissolved and companies run the world. The most popular form of entertainment is a violent sport called Rollerball, designed to promote teamwork and discourage individuality. Jonathan E., played by James Caan, is the star of the game, but when he starts asking questions, the executives decide he needs to retire, alive or not. The movie is shot like a warning that already came true. The arenas are loud, the crowd is hypnotized, and the rules keep changing to make the game bloodier. The sports scenes were filmed with real athletes and stunt performers who were injured more than once because of how rough the choreography got. Kind fractured a rib, but kept filming anyway. Director Norman Jewison fought with the studio over the tone. They wanted more action, he wanted more dread. Some versions of the film even had the ending softened to feel less bleak, depending on where it was released. The helmets and uniforms became a template for future dystopian designs, and the whole thing feels like it's held together by sweat, steel, and corporate silence. Watching it now feels less like science fiction and more like watching the news through a helmet cam.